Welcome to this deep discussion on one of the most powerful and least questioned systems in human history. The way religions shape how we think, what we believe, and even how we see ourselves. This isn't about rituals or traditions on the surface. This is about what happens inside the mind and why these tactics are so effective that they can hold entire populations under their influence for centuries. Religion doesn't spread because of pure logic or evidence. If it did, all faiths would agree on the same truths. Instead, religion uses psychological tools, methods that bypass reason and go straight to emotion, habit, and identity. These methods are so effective that once someone accepts them as a child, it often takes years, sometimes a lifetime, to break free. And here's the most striking part. These tactics are not unique to one faith. They appear everywhere, in different forms, across every religion on Earth. So what makes the human mind so vulnerable to this kind of control? It begins early. Long before we can reason critically, children are natural learners wired to trust authority. That's how they survive. When a parent says fire will burn you, the child doesn't demand evidence, they trust. Religion uses that same trust. It introduces beliefs before skepticism develops, creating what psychologists call a cognitive anchor. Once an idea is anchored during those early years, it becomes the framework through which all other information is filtered. This is why so many adults cling to the faith they were raised in, even when they encounter evidence that challenges it. The tactic here is clear. Start young, repeat often, and surround the child with social pressure so strong that belief feels like reality itself. When you grow up hearing the same story from parents, teachers, friends, and community leaders, that story doesn't feel like one option among many. It feels like truth. And this is reinforced through rituals. Rituals aren't just traditions, they're psychological conditioning. When you kneel, chant, or bow day after day, your body is teaching your brain to submit. Repetition is powerful. Behavioral scientists know that repeated actions create neural pathways. Over time, these patterns become automatic responses, and questioning them feels unnatural, sometimes even dangerous. Ethic and fear is another weapon. Almost every religion introduces the idea of punishment, not just in this life, but for eternity. Eternal reward or eternal torment, heaven or hell. The logic is simple. If you can make someone believe that disbelief carries infinite risk, they will cling to faith no matter what doubts they have. It's the ultimate form of control, because it doesn't stop at behavior, it governs thought itself. Even questioning becomes taboo, framed as sin, and when thinking becomes dangerous, real freedom disappears. But fear alone isn't enough. Religion also uses love. It offers belonging, a sense of family, and unconditional acceptance. On one condition, loyalty. If you obey, you are cherished. If you leave, you are shunned. This is not an accident. Social isolation is one of the most powerful punishments humans can face. Studies show that rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain. Religions leverage this by making community conditional on belief. The message is clear. Without us, you are nothing. With us, you are safe. That's not just spiritual, it's psychological engineering. Language is another tool. Notice how religions use special words, phrases, and tones that create an atmosphere of mystery and authority. Words like sacred, holy, sin, and salvation don't describe physical realities. They shape mental categories. Once those categories exist, they frame every experience. A feeling of awe becomes the presence of God. A coincidence becomes a sign. This is not just semantics. Language guides perception. Control the words, and you control the meaning of life's events. Then there's the tactic of repetition disguised as truth. Say something often enough and it feels real, even without evidence. This is known as the illusory truth effect, and religion uses it constantly. Scriptures are read aloud every week. Prayers are repeated daily. Hymns echo the same themes endlessly. Each repetition strengthens the belief, not through proof, but through familiarity. The mind confuses familiarity with truth. That's why breaking free from these patterns feels like breaking free from reality itself. Guilt and shame are also part of the structure. Most religions teach that humans are inherently flawed, sinful by nature. This belief does something subtle but powerful. It creates a permanent problem that only the religion can solve. You are broken, but we have the cure. This dynamic traps people in a cycle of dependency. Even natural desires, sexuality, ambition, doubt become sins. So you confess, you repent, you submit again. It's a system designed for self-reinforcement. And it works because shame is one of the deepest motivators in human psychology. Another method is selective reward. Religions promise certainty in an uncertain world. They claim to have absolute answers to life's hardest questions: why we exist, what happens after death, how to live a good life. That sense of certainty is addictive, especially in times of chaos. People will cling to comforting answers even if those answers lack evidence, because uncertainty feels unbearable. And once you've accepted the framework, confirmation bias takes over. You notice every event that supports your faith and dismiss anything that contradicts it. The system becomes self-sealing. What's fascinating is how these tactics mirror those used in cults and authoritarian regimes. Control information, isolate from dissent, create an in-group versus out-group mentality, reward obedience, punish questioning, instill fear of consequences, seen or unseen. These are not coincidences. They are psychological strategies honed over centuries because they work. They exploit universal human vulnerabilities: the need for belonging, the fear of death, the craving for certainty. The hardest part is that these tactics don't feel like control from the inside. They feel like comfort. They feel like truth. And that's why they're so effective. People don't think they're brainwashed. They think they're enlightened. The bars of the cage are invisible because they're built from beliefs, and beliefs shape perception itself. Breaking free from this is not about attacking anyone's intelligence. It's about understanding how the mind works and how easily it can be conditioned. Once you see the patterns, you can question them. Once you question them, you can choose. And that choice, real, informed choice, is the beginning of freedom. But freedom is not just escape. It's building a new way of thinking, one rooted in evidence, empathy, and humility. It means facing uncertainty without fear. It means finding meaning not in dogma, but in reality, in the connections we make, the truths we discover, the lives we touch. That's harder than blind faith, but it's more honest. And in the end, it's more human. One of the most underestimated tools in religious conditioning is music. Think about it. Almost every faith tradition uses music in its rituals: hymns, chants, rhythmic recitations. These aren't just aesthetic touches, they're psychological anchors. Neuroscientists have shown that music can bypass rational thought and trigger emotional responses directly. A melody linked to words of devotion doesn't just sound pleasant, it reinforces belief through feeling. Every time a congregation sings together, dopamine is released in the brain, creating a sense of unity and transcendence. That feeling becomes associated with a doctrine being sung about. Over time, the music and the message fuse into one. You no longer just hear the words, you feel them as truth. Architecture plays a similar role. Step inside a cathedral, a mosque, or a temple. What do you notice first? The height, the vast ceilings, the way light filters through stained glass or bounces off polished stone. These spaces are designed to make you feel small and the divine feel immense. It's not accidental, it's engineering. Studies on environmental psychology show that vast spaces with vertical emphasis evoke feelings of awe and submission. When the building itself makes you feel insignificant, you become more receptive to authority. These environments amplify the experience of ritual, making the intangible seem tangible. The design whispers, "This is sacred, this is beyond you." And when the setting tells that story, the mind follows. Now consider repetition in a broader sense. Repetition isn't limited to prayers or verses. It's embedded in the rhythm of life. Weekly gatherings, annual festivals, daily rituals. These routines carve deep grooves in the mind. They turn belief into habit, and habit into identity. And identity is the strongest glue of all. When belief becomes who you are, questioning it feels like self-destruction. That's why people can endure enormous cognitive dissonance rather than abandon faith. It's not just an opinion, it's the core of their self-impetus. This is where childhood conditioning becomes critical. Developmental psychologists explain that children under the age of 7 operate in what's called a highly suggestible brain state. Their critical faculties are not fully formed, so ideas presented by trusted adults go straight into long-term memory without resistance. Teach a child that a particular text is perfect and unquestionable, and that belief becomes almost immune to scrutiny later. Add to that the emotional reinforcement of parental approval and the threat of divine punishment, and you have a belief system that feels as real as gravity. Religions also know how to use scarcity and exclusivity. Many create a sense of being part of a chosen group, a small band of the faithful in a dangerous world. This in-group/out-group dynamic is a powerful social force. It not only creates loyalty but also heightens fear of leaving. If everyone outside the group is portrayed as corrupt, blind, or doomed, walking away feels like stepping into darkness. Political regimes have used this tactic for centuries, labeling dissenters as traitors and outsiders as enemies. Religion uses it to make sure doubt feels like betrayal, not just of God, but of family, friends, and everything familiar. Another tactic that looks benign but cuts deep is confession. Many religions encourage or require adherents to admit their sins, their doubts, their failures, sometimes in front of a priest, sometimes in front of a group. This practice creates a cycle of vulnerability and control. When you confess, you reveal your secrets. That creates shame, and shame makes you dependent on the authority that offers forgiveness. It's a feedback loop. Guilt produces confession, confession produces relief, and relief reinforces loyalty to the system that caused the guilt in the first place. From the outside, it looks like moral growth. From the inside, it's psychological capture. Let's talk about language again, specifically loaded language. Words like faith, grace, blessing, and miracle are framed as positive, beyond question. Doubt becomes temptation. Leaving becomes falling away. These terms don't describe reality neutrally. They frame it to favor belief. This is what social scientists call a thought-terminating cliché, a phrase that shuts down analysis. When someone says, "God works in mysterious ways," the conversation ends. No more questions. The phrase feels like wisdom, but it functions like a wall, and walls keep people inside. What's fascinating is how similar these techniques are to those used by high control groups and authoritarian systems. Propaganda regimes use fear, repetition, symbols, and mass rallies to create unity and obedience. Religions use sermons, rituals, sacred symbols, and festivals for the same purpose. Both promise security in exchange for submission. Both paint outsiders as threats. Both reward conformity and punish dissent. When you strip away the sacred language, the psychological machinery looks nearly identical. The final tactic we'll cover in this part is information control. Many religions discourage or outright forbid access to alternative viewpoints. Historically, that meant banning certain books, punishing heresy, and restricting education. Today, in a connected world, it often means demonizing science, mistrusting media, or warning against worldly ideas. The goal is the same: keep the believer inside an echo chamber, because once competing narratives enter the mind, the illusion of certainty begins to crack. And when certainty cracks, control weakens. When you add all these elements together, music, architecture, repetition, exclusivity, confession, language, information control, you see why religion is so resilient. It doesn't rely on one tactic. It uses an entire system of psychological levers, each reinforcing the others. And because these tactics are woven into culture, they feel invisible. You don't notice the conditioning because it looks like tradition, community, identity, but that's exactly what makes it powerful. Breaking that spell is not easy. It requires more than facts. It requires awareness of the forces shaping belief beneath the surface. Because once you see the machinery, you can step back and ask, do I believe this because it's true, or because it was designed to feel true? That question is the key that unlocks the cage. Why do these tactics work so well? Why can entire populations surrender critical thought and embrace beliefs that often contradict evidence and logic? The answer lies in vulnerabilities that are built into human psychology. Our brains are wired for survival, not for objective truth. In the wild, certainty was safer than doubt. Believing your tribe's rules kept you alive. Obeying authority reduced risk. These instincts, once useful, now make us easy targets for systems designed to exploit them. One of the strongest of these instincts is the fear of death. No matter how advanced society becomes, mortality is a reality no one escapes. That awareness creates a deep, often unconscious anxiety called mortality salience. Psychologists have shown that when people are reminded of death, even subtly, they become more likely to cling to comforting beliefs and more defensive of their worldviews. Religion capitalizes on this vulnerability by offering the ultimate escape: immortality, eternal life in paradise, reunion with loved ones. These promises soothe existential terror so effectively that they override skepticism. When the alternative is nothingness, even the flimsiest evidence feels like hope. Fear doesn't stop at death. It extends to punishment, eternal damnation, reincarnation into lower forms, cosmic consequences. Different religions package it differently, but the principle is the same. Obedience buys safety, disobedience brings catastrophe. This creates what behavioral psychologists call avoidance conditioning, a cycle where you act not for reward, but to avoid unbearable loss. That fear can grip the mind so tightly that even entertaining doubt feels like gambling with eternity. And when the stakes are infinite, reason loses. History offers countless examples of how this psychological leverage can shape entire civilizations. During the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church taught that salvation required obedience to its authority. To question doctrine wasn't just error, it was heresy, punishable by torture or death. This wasn't random cruelty, it was strategic. When people see others burned alive for thinking differently, fear does the work of belief. Similarly, in certain theocratic societies today, apostasy laws carry severe penalties, not because faith is fragile, but because control depends on suppressing alternatives. The harsher the punishment, the stronger the illusion that the belief must be true. Even when the threat of violence fades, the mental cage remains. Many who leave their faith describe something called residual fear, the lingering dread that they might still be wrong, that hell might still exist, that punishment might still come. That fear persists, not because it's rational, but because the brain was conditioned to link doubt with danger from childhood onward. Breaking that link takes time, often years, because the fear was planted in the subconscious long before reason could form a defense. Another vulnerability religions exploit is our craving for belonging. Humans are social creatures. Isolation once meant death, so acceptance feels like life itself. Religions weaponize this by making belief the price of inclusion. You don't just join a faith, you join a family, a tribe. You share meals, songs, secrets. This creates bonds stronger than logic. Leaving doesn't just risk losing an idea, it risks losing everyone you love. Studies show that social rejection activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. That's why many people stay in religions long after they stop believing. They're not clinging to faith, they're clinging to connection. Then there's the authority effect. From an early age, we're conditioned to obey figures of authority, parents, teachers, leaders. This instinct evolved to keep order, but it makes us susceptible to anyone who claims divine sanction. When someone says, "I speak for God," that authority feels absolute. Obedience becomes not just a duty but a moral obligation. This is why charismatic leaders can command unthinkable loyalty, even when their demands defy reason. History is littered with examples, from Jonestown to modern cults, where this obedience led to tragedy. And while mainstream religions seem gentler, the mechanism is the same. Authority framed as sacred is almost impossible to question without feeling guilt or fear. Information control strengthens this effect. For centuries, religious institutions kept scriptures in languages only priests could read. Knowledge was power, and withholding it kept the masses dependent. Today, literal censorship may be rare in some places, but soft censorship persists. Doubt is discouraged. Alternative viewpoints are labeled dangerous. Scientific facts that challenge doctrine are dismissed as lies. The result is an intellectual bubble where the same ideas echo endlessly, making them feel obvious and self-evident. When all voices around you repeat the same narrative, dissent feels unnatural, even treacherous. All these tactics combine to create what psychologists call total environment control. Your senses, your emotions, your social world all align to reinforce one worldview. And because this conditioning starts early, it feels less like persuasion and more like reality. You don't think you believe, you think you know. And knowledge feels unquestionable. That's why conversations about faith often feel futile. You're not debating ideas, you're challenging someone's entire sense of self and security. The cost of this conditioning is enormous. It robs people of autonomy. It shapes life choices, marriage, education, career, not through free will, but through fear and guilt. It can delay scientific progress, fuel intolerance, and justify violence. But the deepest cost is personal. The quiet loss of curiosity. When questions are replaced with answers too sacred to examine, the mind stops growing. And a mind that stops growing is a tragedy. Because growth is what makes us human. Yet, despite this, there is hope. History shows that conditioning can be undone, not easily, but powerfully. When societies value critical thinking, when information flows freely, when questioning is celebrated rather than punished, belief systems shift. And with each generation that learns to ask instead of obey, the hold of these ancient tactics weakens. The truth is, these tactics have worked for thousands of years because they were invisible. People didn't recognize them as tactics. They thought they were sacred truths. But today, something is changing. For the first time in history, knowledge isn't locked away in monasteries or guarded by clerics. It's everywhere. The internet shattered the monopoly of information. A teenager with a phone has access to more data than entire libraries once held. And with that access comes exposure to different worldviews. When you can compare your beliefs with thousands of others, the illusion that we alone have the truth begins to crumble. Social media, for all its flaws, has done something remarkable. It gave doubters a voice. In the past, leaving a religion meant isolation, fear, and shame. Now, entire communities exist where people share their stories of breaking free. They offer support, validation, and answers that once seemed forbidden. These networks are lifelines for those questioning faith in places where doubt is still dangerous, and they do more than provide comfort. They show that leaving is possible, and life outside the cage is not empty, but full of possibility. Education plays an even bigger role. As science literacy spreads, the old narratives lose their grip. Evolution explains life without invoking gods. Neuroscience reveals how consciousness emerges from the brain, not from an immortal soul. Psychology explains morality without commandments carved in stone. These insights don't make life meaningless, they make it understandable. And once people understand, fear loses its power. The promise of heaven and the threat of hell sound less like ultimate truths and more like tools of control. But freedom is not just intellectual, it's emotional. Breaking free from conditioning is hard because it means dismantling the identity built around it. It feels like betrayal, not just of beliefs, but of family, culture, and self. That's why compassion matters. People don't escape brainwashing by being mocked or shamed. They escape when someone gives them space to question without fear, to doubt without punishment. This is how the spell breaks. Not with force, but with curiosity. What happens after the spell breaks? Some fear a void, but the reality is different. When you step out of the cage, the world doesn't shrink, it expands. Meaning doesn't vanish, it multiplies. You find purpose in relationships, creativity, discovery, and the pursuit of truth. You realize morality isn't obedience, it's empathy. You stop living for a reward in another world and start living fully in this one. And that shift doesn't just change individuals, it changes societies. Nations where questioning is free tend to be more peaceful, more innovative, and more just. The decline of authoritarian belief is not a loss, it's progress. Yet the old systems won't give up easily. They will fight to maintain control using fear, guilt, and nostalgia. They will call doubt dangerous and independence evil. But the pattern of history is clear. No system built on fear survives forever. Every empire of control collapses when minds refuse change, and that refusal is spreading, quietly, persistently, everywhere. Exposing these tactics matters because it arms people with awareness. When you see the mechanism, it loses its magic. You stop mistaking conditioning for conviction. You start asking the question religions fear most, not what if I'm wrong, but what if they are. And once that question takes root, the old power structures tremble. So why talk about brainwashing tactics used by religions? Because sunlight is the best disinfectant. Because freedom begins with clarity. And because the future belongs not to those who submit to inherited illusions, but to those who dare to think for themselves. That is the quiet revolution happening now, not in temples, but in minds. And the more we understand it, the faster it will grow. Thank you for listening. Share your thoughts below. What tactic do you think is most powerful and why? And if this opens something for you, share it with someone who needs to see behind the curtain. Because the truth is simple. Control works best in darkness, and every conversation like this brings a little more light.